In July of 2026, Christopher Nolan, the most self-serious director working in Hollywood, a man who built an entire movie around a physics lecture and made it $1 billion, released a 3-hour film about a Greek soldier who fights a cyclops, gets seduced by a witch, sails past a six-headed monster, and travels to the literal underworld. And critics are calling it one of the best films of his career. Here's the thing nobody's saying out loud. That description I just gave you, Cyclops, witch, sea monster underworld field trip, that's not just Homer's Odyssey. That's also, structurally, beat for beat, the plot engine of a Marvel movie. Today, I want to show you exactly how Christopher Nolan, of all people, took the oldest, densest, most homework assignment coded piece of Western literature and ran it through the same storytelling machine that built the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I want to show you why that's not an insult. It might be the smartest adaptation decision he's ever made. Quick confession: I read the Odyssey in 10th grade, and I remember almost none of it. Not because it's bad, it's one of the foundational texts of human storytelling, but because it was never built for how we consume stories now. It's an oral poem meant to be performed over multiple nights, full of repeated phrases, so an ancient audience could keep track of who's who, packed with digressions, genealogies, and a structure that jumps around in time. Before nonlinear storytelling was cool, most attempts to adapt it fail for one of two reasons. Either they get so reverent to the text that the movie feels like eating your vegetables. Think the History Channel miniseries nobody remembers. Or they strip out everything interesting to make an action movie, and you get something that has nothing to say. Nolan did neither. Instead, he did something much more interesting. He looked at this 2,800-year-old story and adapted it the way Kevin Feige adapts a 60-year-old comic book. Let me show you exactly what I mean. Chapter 1. The problem with Homer. First, let's actually talk about why the original text is such a nightmare to adapt. The Odyssey is 24 books long. It doesn't start with Odysseus leaving Troy. It starts 10 years later, with his son Telemachus, moping around a palace full of freeloading suitors who are trying to marry his mother. We don't even meet Odysseus until book 5. And once we do, half his adventures, the Cyclops, Circe, the Sirens, are told in flashback at a dinner party by Odysseus himself, essentially as an after-dinner anecdote. That's not how modern audiences want their heroes introduced. Imagine if Iron Man opened with 40 minutes of Pepper Potts running Stark Industries, and Tony didn't show up until Reel 2, and even then it was Tony telling someone else a story about the cave. On top of the structure, there's the language. Homeric epic is built on repetition. Rosy-fingered Dawn, swift-footed Achilles, the same descriptive phrases recurring dozens of times, because this poem was designed to be memorized and performed, not read silently in 3 sittings on a Tuesday. It's a technology built for oral tradition, not for a movie screen. So here's Nolan's first move, and it's a smart one. He reorders events, elides huge amounts of the original text, and amalgamates characters. He starts the story, where it actually begins dramatically, not with Telemachus moping, but with Odysseus, years deep into a journey home he can't seem to finish, already carrying the weight of everything he's done. That's not just a structural fix, that's a Marvel move. That's exactly the in medias res, then flashback to the origin, trick that Feige's writers use in almost every first act. Chapter 2. The Marvel Formula, applied to Greece. Let's actually build the Marvel formula, box by box, and then map Nolan's Odyssey onto it. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Box 1. The wounded hero with a past he's trying to outrun. Tony Stark has Afghanistan. Steve Rogers has the war he woke up from decades too late. Nolan's Odysseus has Troy. And crucially, Nolan reimagines him not as Homer's clever schemer who loves war, but as a weary pragmatist searching for peace after an endless campaign of brutality. Box 2. The Episodic Gauntlet, a series of boss fights against distinct, visually iconic villains, each with their own rules and powers. This is the entire back half of the Odyssey, and it maps perfectly onto the villain of the week structure Marvel uses in every solo film and every phase. You don't beat the final boss first. You climb a ladder of increasingly strange threats. Nolan's Polyphemus, the Cyclops, isn't some cartoon monster. He's built practically, hidden by shadow and naturalistic camera movement. And the film frames him almost sympathetically, as a giant shepherd suffering a home invasion by very small thieves. Then there's Circe, whose transformation of Odysseus's men is staged as one of the most genuinely horrifying sequences in Nolan's entire filmography. Then Scylla, the sea monster. Handled with the same grammar as the Cyclops, glimpsed only in fragments, men snatched skyward in seconds. Each of these is a distinct set piece, with its own visual language, its own rules, its own stakes. That's not epic poetry structure. That's Marvel's villain of the week structure. Wearing a toga, box 3. The mentor figure who shows up periodically to move the plot and dispense cryptic wisdom. Every MCU hero gets one. Nick Fury, Yoda adjacent characters, the wise old master. Nolan gives Odysseus exactly one god who actually appears on screen. Athena, played by Zendaya, is the only deity who shows up in the story, appearing to converse with and warn Odysseus through frustrating riddles. Every other Olympian is kept off screen, a rule, not a character. That's a very deliberate choice. It turns a pantheon into a single efficient mentor role. It's Nick Fury with a spear. Box 4. The home front subplot that raises the emotional stakes of the final battle. While the hero's off having his adventures, someone back home is dealing with the fallout. Think Pepper Potts running the company. Think the family stakes in every Avengers finale. Here, that's Penelope and Telemachus holding Ithaca together against a house full of suitors, while Telemachus grows from the green kid archetype into someone capable of standing beside his father in the final act. And Box 5, the climactic team-up battle where everything converges. In the Odyssey, that's the slaughter of the suitors. Odysseus, Telemachus, and a loyal servant or two versus a hall full of armed men. In Marvel terms, that's the third act battle where the hero, the sidekick, and the found family all fight side by side against the assembled threat. Nolan didn't have to invent this structure. Homer basically wrote the first version of it. Nolan just recognized it. Chapter 3. Simplify, combine, ground it. Here's where it gets really interesting though, because building a good blockbuster isn't just about matching a formula. It's about ruthless simplification. And this is exactly what Marvel does to 60 years of tangled comic continuity, and it's exactly what Nolan does to Homer, take Calypso, and the Lotus Eaters. In the original poem, these are two completely separate episodes. The Lotus Eaters are a brief, forgettable detour where some of Odysseus's men eat a memory-erasing plant. Calypso is a whole different island, years later, where a nymph keeps Odysseus as a captive lover. Nolan fuses them into one sequence. His Calypso, played by Charlize Theron, falls for Odysseus and gets him addicted to lotus flowers that render him an amnesiac, keeping him from ever getting home. Two minor, disconnected plot points become one efficient, visually coherent sequence with a clear emotional hook. A man who is forgetting his own family. That's not vandalism of the source material. That's the exact same editorial instinct that made Marvel condense decades of comic book Avengers rosters into a team of 6 people you could actually remember. Same thing happens with the gods. Homer's poem has dozens of divine figures constantly meddling, arguing on Olympus, intervening on a whim. Nolan strips that down until only Athena physically appears in the story. Every other god becomes a rule of the universe rather than a character with a face. That's a huge, confident cut, and it's the same cut Marvel made when it decided most of its cosmic entities would stay as background lore rather than constant on screen presences. And then there's the visual philosophy, which might be the most Nolan thing about the whole project. He drew heavily on the practical, in camera monster work of special effects legend Ray Harryhausen, the guy behind the original stop motion Cyclops and Skeleton Warriors from decades of fantasy films. And true to form for a director who's always pushed a don't try to understand it, feel it approach to fantastical concepts. Every monster here is interpreted as if it could plausibly have existed in real ancient history. That's the exact same trick Marvel used to sell audiences on a Norse god and a genetically modified super soldier sharing a screen. You ground the impossible in enough physical, tactile detail that the audience's brain stops asking, is this realistic? And starts asking what happens next. Nolan didn't invent grounded fantasy. He just pointed the technique at Homer instead of a comic book. Chapter 4. Injecting a modern argument into an ancient myth. There's one more trick Marvel is famous for, and Nolan pulls it here too. Taking an old story and quietly loading it with a very current thesis. So the spectacle is doing double duty as commentary. Marvel does this constantly. A super soldier processing endless war, a genius arms dealer wrestling with the weapons he built. Homer's Odyssey is, on its surface, a story about getting home. Nolan adds a second layer underneath it, a story about guilt. In Nolan's version, Odysseus carries deep guilt over the trick of the wooden horse, a gift the Trojans brought inside their own walls in good faith, which the Greeks then used to violate that trust with total violence. Odysseus starts to believe he didn't just win a war, he broke something more fundamental about how civilization holds itself together. And then Nolan pays that idea off at home. Penelope comes to realize that the mysterious raiders threatening Ithaca aren't some foreign menace. They're the Greek armies themselves, brutalized by a decade of war and cascading into the exact kind of barbarism Odysseus feared he'd unleashed. The monster isn't really the Cyclops. The monster is what war does to the people who survive it. That's not something Homer's original text spells out this explicitly. That's Nolan's addition, a modern, almost Oppenheimer adjacent anxiety about whether the tools we build to win eventually turn around and consume us, grafted onto a 2,800-year-old adventure story. It's the same move as making Tony Stark's arc, partly about the ethics of the weapons industry. You take audiences who came for the monster of the week spectacle, and you smuggle in an actual argument. There's even a sequence, a young soldier named Sinon, pivotal to the Trojan horse plan, who returns from the dead in a scene that visually owes as much to a zombie movie as it does to Homer, that plays almost like a self-aware wink. Yes, we know we're borrowing genre grammar from somewhere else entirely to make this ancient material hit harder. That's not disrespecting the source. That's understanding exactly what a modern audience needs to feel the weight of it. So let's zoom back out. What did all of this actually buy Nolan? An opening weekend that outpaced Oppenheimer's, a film that won 7 Oscars, a budget of roughly $250 million, making this the biggest production of his career, shot entirely on IMAX 70mm, a format nobody had committed to this fully before, and critics calling it a staggering achievement, not despite the liberties taken with Homer, but often because of them. Here's my actual argument, and I want to be careful about it. This isn't a story about Nolan dumbing down great literature. It's the opposite. It's a demonstration that the structure underneath the greatest blockbuster formula of the last 15 years, wounded hero, episodic gauntlet of villains, a mentor, a home front, a final stand, isn't a modern invention at all. Marvel didn't invent that shape. Homer basically wrote the first draft of it 3,000 years ago. Nolan just had the nerve and the studio backing to point a $250 million camera at that fact and say, watch, this still works. Which raises the real question I want to leave you with, and I genuinely want to know what you think. If the Odyssey was secretly a superhero movie all along, what other boring classic from your high school reading list is actually hiding a blockbuster inside it? The Iliad, Beowulf, Paradise Lost? Drop your pick in the comments. I might build the next video around whichever one comes up the most. If you like this breakdown, there's a whole series brewing on how prestige directors keep quietly borrowing genre movie DNA to sell audiences on difficult material. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it, and I'll see you in the next one.